May I thank you for your kindness, your participation, your friendliness. I don't think I've ever been in a friendlier group. And for the wonderful meals. I will stagger home many pounds. I don't know whether it's to the good or to the bad, but anyway, many pounds have been added in the meals of this week. But thank you for everything that you have done. We do come this evening to the subject of the Baptist tradition and Christian renewal. And may I say that my hope and intent is that I am here as a sympathetic, though critical, observer of the Baptist tradition. In my position in a trans-denominational school, where you are training people for the ministry in several dozen denominations, one tries to learn appreciation and the expression of that appreciation for all groups. In case, however, other word has got out, I do have to confess that on occasion as an administrator, I have felt myself under pressure by certain Baptist brothers and sisters. I have been known on occasion to say, I hope in small groups, but the word can filter out, this kind of word does, in a moment of utter frustration and exasperation, that the worst nightmare I could conceive is to wake up and find myself in a world peopled by nothing but Baptists. May I say that is not my true sentiment. That was only in the feeling that one had been driven to the limit. Let us, however, go on from that. I believe if one were to ask a representative group of fairly knowledgeable Canadian Christians, which of the Canadian denominations is most likely to be involved in Christian renewal, I would imagine a lot of us would say the Baptists. So it would seem to me you have an identification in many Christian consciousness with this theme. And so we come to our subject. Let's start a bit historically. The Baptists were an integral part of those 18th and 19th centuries that we spoke, and even of some of those of lesser compass into earlier parts of the 20th century. In that first awakening, which we suggested probably was in the period 1735 to 85, the Baptists in New England came to be in a flourishing condition, and that may be an understatement. When we think of the leadership of Isaac Backus, when we think of the evangelistic ministry of those churches, when we think of the emphasis of Professor Hebert of Boston, that it was the Baptists from the hinterland of Massachusetts and other states who really brought the American Revolution to existence, then I think we see that the first awakening Baptists were a great force in church and society. From New England, of course, the story is that the Baptist missionaries went to the southern colonies, as they still were, and planted what developed into by far the largest Baptist concentration in the world. Here in Nova Scotia and New Brunswick, in that period, at least the precursor of the great maritime Baptist movement was to be found. Then we mentioned there was the second awakening from roughly 1785 to 1825. The Baptists in the United States saw spectacular church growth. with membership doubling in the decade between 1802 and 1812. I suppose church growth studies have been done on this, but here it would seem to me you really have church growth par excellence. This is the kind of growth we talk about in the two-thirds world today. But to see this happening in our own situation would be a subject of very great interest. And when we remember that in most Baptist congregations, as well as in a number of others, the number of hearers who were not members but regular attenders could be 5 times the number of the regular members, then we begin to get some sense of the numerical growth and size of this body. We think of this period and the Baptist farmer preachers, as they were called, performing that unique task of living on the frontier, being engaged in farming and at the same time being the pastors of those churches, and so relevant in their ministry. In England at the same time, as the research of Derek Lovegrove, that Baptist church historian of St. Andrews University in Scotland, has shown, much of the similar growth of the Baptists in England was attributable to the work of itinerant evangelists, a form of ministry which seemed particularly well suited to the English situation. During this period of time of the Second Awakening, the number of Baptist church edifices in England increased 4-fold. The Baptists in maritime Canada experienced explosive church growth, beginning to reach those 19th century percentages, which I still find it hard to take in, with 25% of the population of New Brunswick being Baptist, and the figure reaching into the high teens percentage-wise here in Nova Scotia. The Third Awakening, which we suggested came somewhere from the mid-1850s to around 1890, saw the Baptists continue to forge ahead, and nowhere more than in that great heartland of the southern American states. I remember being profoundly moved hearing Rosalind Carter, the wife of former President Carter, writing in a magazine about the spiritual heritage that she had, and how one of her grandfathers, whom she remembered as a little girl, this would be in the 1920s, had fought in the Civil War. So he must have been a man in his late 70s, early 80s when she remembers him, and how he had come to Christ in those great services in the Confederate Army. And again, one just had underscored by a very prominent individual the vast strengths of these renewal movements in the southern states, and of course, how, in large measure, it was Baptist people who were involved. One also thinks of the Baptist churches throughout North America, in England, with their strong stress on urban ministry. I think of the city of Toronto. In this era, seeing the great building of Jarvis Street Church in the 1870s, of Bloor Street Church in the early 80s, of Walmer Road in the late 80s. How attuned the Baptists were to the expanding urban situation of North America. And of course, we think of the model for so much of this in Spurgeon's Metropolitan Tabernacle in London, England, seating, 5,500 people with no modern electronic means of communication. I don't know what kind of a larynx the man had, or diaphragm, but he certainly must have had a wonderful apparatus that he could preach in that twice on Sunday for years and years and years. And then we mentioned that although this great series of what are called the evangelical awakenings began to decline very rapidly in the 1890s and on into this century, nonetheless there was a brief period which we unimaginatively referred to as the Fourth Awakening in the brief period 1904 to 1910. We have already noted that this is the birthplace of Pentecostalism. That doesn't say very much to Baptists, particularly at that time. But it is also the time of the Welsh revival, which had a strong Baptist component. But, surely much more, it is the period when the Baptist missionaries from Wales are at work in northeastern India, in Assam, and here that church grows and grows and grows until there are sub-tribal groups which today claim to be 98% Christian. Very few places in the two-thirds world, in spite of all that's going on, do you get that kind of situation under Baptist missionary work. Then we mentioned that there were some subsequent, smaller, usually geographically or denominationally restricted movements in the interwar period. In the 1920s in Russia, for example, when the communist government trained its guns upon the Russian Orthodox Church, the Protestants were left virtually undisturbed. And the Baptists and the Mennonites, in the grace of God, seized that opportunity, and those churches experienced such surges of life that they have been shaped from that day until this by that experience of the 1920s. Not so many Russian Baptists coming to Canada, some, but of course all kinds of Russian Mennonites coming to the prairies of Western Canada, particularly in the late 20s. And if you engage in any inter-church activities in Canada that have Western Canadians, you'll soon find Mennonites involved, Russian Mennonites. And the strength and virility of their Christian faith and that which they've inherited goes right back to this Russian movement of the 1920s. In fact, it was those coming from Russia who reawakened a lot of the Mennonites who were in danger of going to sleep in southern Manitoba and in parts of Saskatchewan, who had been the earlier immigrants of the 1870s to Western Canada. There are a few of these other minor movements. Let me just say a word about what I think is the end of the line of all of these movements that go back to 1735 with that first awakening of Jonathan Edwards and his congregation in Northampton, and of the conversion of George Whitefield and of several of the famous Welsh evangelists. That long, long heritage, I think it may have come to its final resting place in the Canadian city of Saskatoon in 1971. And I think it would only be because of the peculiar ethnic populations surrounding and in the city of Saskatoon that that should have taken place. If you know the movement that occurred in Saskatoon in 1971, sometimes called the Prairie Revival, it is, of course, associated with two brothers, evangelists by the name of the Sutera twins. But they were only there a brief while and moved on. And then the movement continued and continued to grow and grow and grow. Where did it meet? In the Ukrainian Baptist Church. And who was the speaker? He was a pastor of the General Conference or Swedish Baptist Church. So it seemed to me the Baptists have a lot of involvement over this vast period running really over more than 2 centuries. So the people who say almost instinctively as Christians, the Baptists would probably be the first of the historic denominations involved in renewal, I think they would have a lot of reason for so saying. Baptists in many ways are renewal people, with all that implies. Some weeks ago, I was having a conversation with a knowledgeable Christian friend, one who travels widely and speaks in many places. And in talking about the various ministries and projects in which we were engaged, I mentioned that I was coming here to Acadia. He said, "What are you going to be speaking on?" And so I rattled off the little list of subjects. We'd be talking about the Methodist Pentecostal heritage. We'd be talking about the Evangelical Anglicans. We'd be talking about Chinese and Korean Christians. And then I said, the Baptist tradition. And my friend, who's a polite sort of man, gave kind of a snort. And he said, "What have Baptists to do with renewal?" I wondered if he was being unusually rude. But as I looked at him, no, I realized he had made what he thought was a perfectly reasonable comment. I said, well, now let's look at what's going on in the world today. I said, my travels in New Zealand about 10 years ago, and speaking from the south end of the South Island up at least to Auckland, over and over again I was hearing that probably 2/3 of the Baptist congregations in New Zealand were plugged in to fairly recent forms of renewal. Oh, he said, I've been to New Zealand, but I never saw the Baptists. Well, that was not much help. I realized he wasn't going to be convinced by me. I said, okay, what about England? I said, one of the great delights of my sabbatical a couple of years ago in England was to see the wonderful change going on in many of the Baptist churches. I hadn't been in England for any length of time for about 13 years. And it just seemed that wonderful, wonderful changes were going on. And his answer was, yes, that's true about England. But he said it's only very recent. Well, yes, I was prepared to agree with him on that point. Anyway, as we sat and batted this subject back and forth, he sort of on one side of the question, I on the other, the point he seemed to be saying was that Baptists are the most renewal-oriented people in the world once they get onto it. But they can be slow to start. So we left our friendly chat that evening, and over in my mind, I have turned this thesis. Once Baptists get involved in renewal, they are its heartiest and most faithful supporters, but it takes them time to get started. That only may be an expression of wisdom, but it may have other explanations. I have tried out this interpretation on a few friends, Baptist friends, some of whom you will know, who are grads of Acadia now in Toronto. And it seemed to strike some kind of responsive chord. Now, I don't know if they were just wanting to be polite, but I'm no longer their boss, so they don't have to be polite to me anymore. And anyway, I'm glad that we're not having questions this evening because I might get slaughtered. But anyway, I didn't realize that. I thought we might have questions tonight. Anyway, let me give you some data which at least may make this statement a valid subject of debate and discussion, although it may well be rejected. The first reason for suggesting it is that the English Baptists had their founding in a day of somewhat decline. The Reformation movement was beginning to wind down by the 1640s, when the major stream of the Baptists, the regular Calvinistic Baptists, were coming on the scene. And I think all of us are somewhat influenced by our origins. It may be much more visceral and cerebral, our consciousness of this, but still it can happen. And it seems to me that the early English Baptists, at least fairly early, were kind of a defensive group. That's inevitable. If you're in decline, you're sort of having to defend yourself. You don't have that buoyant expectation that comes with any fairly new group or any Christian group that's part of the first generation of something that's going to flourish. Maybe this is part of it. Maybe Baptists have a certain instinctive, built-in sense of defense that may cause them to wait a while. And that may be the policy of wisdom, as we've suggested. Then I would suggest that the early regular Baptists were a very theologically articulate group. And I think groups that have a clear and articulate theology, as we see emerging in the London Confession, sometimes find it difficult to respond to new things because they believe they've got all the bases covered rather well. We've got it all, not in a proud sort of sense, but in a sense that we have been bequeathed a wonderful heritage, and we're not going to move away from that without very, very good and evident reason. I think another factor that may slow down some Baptists, and I'm not certainly suggesting this is true of all, would be certain extremes in theology. A good theological system, but maybe taking some things to an extreme. And here one thinks of the fact that many of the Baptists found it difficult to relate to the first awakening of the 18th century. The Wesleys and the Whitfield and that whole group of Anglicans, and as they become Methodists and then others in the Anglican Church and in some of the Congregationalists responding very eagerly and very readily and very speedily. It really seems to be about the 1780s before the Baptists are responding. And there was this theology of hyper-Calvinism that was part of much of Baptist life, which in its desire to extol the sovereignty of God in personal salvation as in every other way, stressed that there was nothing that could be done humanly. One could only wait upon God. One could not repent, because they read the verse in the book of Acts that God granted repentance. And so until God granted repentance, there was no point doing anything about it. And then, of course, there was the concept that it was dangerous to preach the gospel to the non-elect, because God's sovereignty might be compromised, since through the preaching of the gospel some of the non-elect may be caught in the gospel net. We are reminded, of course, of the words of the old minister in the Northamptonshire Association, well on towards the end of the 18th century, who said to young Carey, who was eager about missionary service overseas, "Young man, when God decides to save the heathen, he will do it without your help or mine." A grand word of brotherly encouragement from one of the older saints to one of the younger. But that, of course, is fueled by the hyper-Calvinistic theology. I believe this did hold back the response of the Baptists to the first awakening in England. Is there any application of this in our day? Well, we mentioned in our talk on Monday evening that the eschatology of premillennialism would probably have squelched the renewal exuberance of the Pentecostals if they hadn't, by a certain sleight of hand, brought in a latter-day view. It seems to me that many Baptists have espoused a premillenarian view in this century, but without any latter rain. And as a result, it can give a very somber and even pessimistic view of the prospects of the Church of Christ and of society prior to the second advent of our Lord. And that may well have held others back in our day from expecting any renewal or wanting to do anything about it. Now, I think I ought to say here, as a result of conversations with some people one-to-one, that I was not advocating, as a result of a certain put-down of premillennialism, any millenarian option. I don't think any of the millenarian options we've got are beginning to get the teaching of the Bible well together. Each seems to have a few valid points and a good many that are not. So I just hope some thoughtful, good exegetes will work hard at this subject, and probably in the next 200 years we'll find some kind of resolution. I don't think it'll happen much earlier than that. But it does seem, as in so many things, extremes or imbalances can do a great deal to hold the church back, and I'm wondering if this is part of what may happen to some of the Baptist community. There may be other things along the theological line that I should be aware of. Then I think there is an element perhaps of restorationism among the Baptists, which may also help to hold back from moving, at least speedily, into renewal movements. All serious Christianity is in constant interaction with the New Testament. But the word restorationism, at least as it's used by church historians, refer to those groups who perceive that in the New Testament there is not only a lot of basic teaching, there is also a basic pattern of church order and church polity and church life. And it is their purpose, among other things, to reduplicate this as much as possible. Now, it seems to me the danger is, if you think you have reduplicated the New Testament church, you can't improve on that. There is really very little room for renewal. Again, it sort of seems you've kind of got it. Now, maybe some will disagree very strongly with this approach. It does seem to me that it can produce a static situation. Now, the cults are at their best at this kind of thing. A group like the Plymouth Brethren are way down the track, more than any Baptists, I'm sure, on that. And yet we see today the terrible struggles going on in North America between younger brethren who see that in the New Testament there may be a fair pluriformity of church patterns, and the older guard who are saying we've got it and we're not budging one iota from it. Is there some of this in Baptist circles? Then it seems to me the matter of past faithfulness can also get in the way. This might be seen to work in a couple of directions. We have been faithful to God in difficult days. And God has blessed us for our faithfulness. Therefore, if there is any movement of renewal to come, we will be the first to get it. And if we're not a part of it, it's obviously not real, because we are the faithful people of God. Now, I'm not wanting to attribute this to any individual, but it does seem to me perfectly possible from the people who've been faithful. This would seem to be one of the kind of twists that faithfulness can produce. We've been part of renewals and awakenings in the past. We've been more faithful to that paradigm than anybody else. Therefore, God will bless us first. There was an interesting example of this kind of thing in the early days of the First Awakening in the 1730s. We've alluded to the Jonathan Edwards movement beginning in Northampton, Massachusetts. And Edwards must have been like an F.F. Bruce. He wrote everything he ever said. And so he wrote and he published and he published and he published. And of course, you remember he published that narrative of the surprising work of God in Northampton. And when it was quickly published in Boston, copies of it got overseas. And the nonconformists were the one to get it. And oh, they were so excited. Congregationalists mostly, but some of the Baptists, if I remember correctly. And they were greatly moved to pray that this kind of renewing that was taking place in the colony of Massachusetts would take place in England. And they prayed and they prayed and they prayed. And God answered their prayer. The only thing he answered it by blessing a bunch of lousy Anglicans. And this, I think, was one of the most terrible psychological shocks in English church history. It's tough, isn't it, when you pray for God's blessing and God blesses people you don't think deserve it. In fact, deserve his blessing least than any. And certainly they deserve it far least than us, the faithful people of God. I wonder if there might be that working out of the matter of faithfulness. One might continue, but I think you get the drift. I'm groping here. Because we do see in the first evangelical awakening, the Baptists were very slow to get off the ground. Once they got off the ground by late 1780s, they're moving like a train hurtling down the track, but they were slow. And if what I see in certain areas today may be present company totally accepted, there are people who in the Baptist communion seem to be saying, let's put the brakes on. This is not of God. This is of Satan. So on. Why? Why should that be? I'm just offering a few things that have gone through my head, and you may come up with others, or you may come up with good opposition to these. I hope we may have some chance somewhere, even just personally, to ruminate on these matters. I think that's enough of this subject. What I'd like to do in closing, and I've tried to keep it a good deal shorter tonight. I've been running 15 minutes overtime every night, and I felt that we couldn't do that tonight. And in mentioning it to Dr. Ashley, he heaved a great sigh of relief, I sense. So I think it's very hopeful if we can stay within our limits. What I would like to do is give you a couple of illustrations of what I have seen in Baptist circles in recent years that has impressed me immensely, of Baptist congregations being greatly involved and open to the work of God in our day. The first is in the city of Cambridge in England, where we spent a year's sabbatical a couple of years ago. I don't know if many of you read the Christian Century. It had an article a number of months ago by a professor of religion from a southern U.S. church college entitled The Cambridge Evangelicals. He described 3 congregations in the city of Cambridge that he wanted to draw to the attention of the readers of the magazine. The first was one we have already mentioned, the Round Church, an Anglican congregation. I don't think there's any need to add to what we said the other evening. The second was St. Andrew's Baptist Church, placed on one of the main thoroughfares very near the university buildings in the city of Cambridge. This is a Baptist Union congregation, I imagine a parallel to the Atlantic Convention. The third was Eden Baptist Chapel, a strict and particular Baptist chapel being found in the Fitzroy area of Cambridge, which used to be a very run-down shopping area, but in recent years has had a massive transformation of new buildings. It, too, is only a few stones throw away from at least some of the colleges of Cambridge University. This writer expressed the fact that the preaching in all 3 of these congregations was exegetical and expository. And he made this fascinating comment: I never knew there was such intellectual power in preaching from the text of Scripture. Well, brother, we're glad you found out. It's wonderful to come to fairly well on in life and make great discoveries. The tremendous intellectual force and power of the Bible, dealing with the greatest and profoundest of all issues. The Bible is much more than a description of intellectual power, but it certainly is that. And having heard some of the preachers preach in these places, and some of them being young curates and assistants, I could only applaud him for what he had seen. I found my own mind and heart and being drawn out after the kind of preaching that one was receiving. But let me put these into context. Eden Baptist Chapel. When I was first a student at Cambridge University some 35 years ago, it was a group of about 50 people, and simply because I'm an antiquarian at heart, I go and seek these sort of places out. Anybody who wants a blessing doesn't follow me. I go alone. But I like to poke my nose around. 50 people in a gaunt Victorian structure. Ugly. Oh, it was ugly. They gave all the usual expression of the hyper-Calvinists. Before the service started, you thought a scythe had gone over the congregation because everybody was sitting like this. If you've ever been in a hyper-Calvinistic congregation, you know exactly what I'm saying. They not only did not welcome you, they looked askance at you because they didn't know what to do with an outsider. I would imagine probably in a generation, no outsider had ever dared to enter. I'm really not trying to stretch this into ridicule. This is just exactly the way one felt and what it was like. Today, years later, one of the ablest preachers in England is certainly in that congregation, Dr. Roy Clements, who has a PhD in chemistry from the Imperial College in London, who served with the well-known Baptist, the Reverend Tom Houston, in the great Nairobi Baptist Church for some time, and felt the call of God to that angular little congregation in 1979. And under his ministry, that congregation has grown and flourished. In the late 80s, they built one of the most modern church edifices in England, seating 500 people, filled morning and evening. In the relatively small city of Cambridge, they have established 2 satellite congregations. The service is filled with young people and with students, as well as many others. Any time I have come out of the services there, I have felt the worship, the preaching, the warmth of the fellowship. I have just found myself greatly blessed and drawn and attracted, finding it a magnetic kind of situation of Christian faith and Christian life. That's one example. The other, St. Andrew's Baptist Church. My memories of occasionally attending it some 35 years ago was of an aging and a dying congregation who tended to be speaking of people and events of the early part of the century, and it seemed to be getting further away from reality and existence. Michael Quick came to that congregation in the early 1980s. Congregation rapidly filled up as these other ones have done. One Sunday night, I went there to a youth rally. Now, Cambridge is the center of a lot of Baptist life in little countryside chapels throughout the fenlands of East Anglia. And obviously they had come in their carloads. But it was wonderful to see St. Andrew's Church filled with young people that Sunday night. What a difference from what I had seen a generation before. They had an evangelistic service. And who was the evangelist? An Anglican clergyman evangelist by the name of Daniel Cousins, who lives just on the outside of Cambridge and is well known. I thought how absolutely wonderful that the Baptists would go for the best evangelist around. And in England today, most of the evangelists are Anglicans. And so they went for Daniel. They didn't seem to care that he was an Anglican. And he gave just a wonderful gospel message. Invited young people to come to Christ. The response, I don't know, 35 or more young people there at the front after that service. I just went out into the evening thanking God for what was taking place in that very important and strategic and prominent Baptist congregation. Now, Michael Quick has just gone, as many of you know, to become the principal of Spurgeon's College in London, and it'll be interesting to see. I'm sure there are great new things ahead for St. Andrew's congregation. The other place I would like to mention is Toronto. The congregation with any life in it that is near our home, and so we get the breezes of it fairly constantly. It is a Baptist congregation. It belongs to your sister group, the Baptist Convention of Ontario and Quebec. It is called Spring Garden Baptist Church. I find that some Baptists have fairly strong feelings about Spring Garden. Some be positive, some be negative. Well, as a 14-year-old resident nearby, let me tell you what I see and whiff over these years. I sense a consistently dedicated ministry. When you have a ministerial staff of 5 or 6 or 7, and lots of them are fairly young, inevitably there's going to be turnover. But I have never heard from any neighbors or any other people any comment but that they are dedicated people to their work of Christian ministry. John McClaverty is the senior. He was called to that congregation to be the senior minister when he was 29. John had been a student of mine at Regent College in Vancouver, and I will never forget the number of calls that I received in Vancouver from deacons of Spring Garden Baptist Church when they were considering McClaverty. And over and over and over again, the issue was, but he's so young. He's 29. Oh dear, I kept my tongue as long as I could, and then I said, my dear cotton-picking Baptist brethren, you all spout effusively about the great Spurgeon who went to Park Street Chapel at 19 in the 19th century. And here in the later part of the 20th century, you think a man at 29 can't have God's hand upon him. That if you get a good 29-year-old, you may have 20, 25 wonderful years together. And you certainly won't have that if you get somebody a good deal older. I don't know whether my words had any impact or not, but they called McClaverty. Now, McClaverty is a bit of a maverick. He's got to lead with his chin. He would burst if he didn't. He is as Irish, what's the old saying, as the pigs of Doherty. And he has that kind of Irishism about him. He will always be causing trouble for somebody. But surely in the kingdom of God there's the place for these feisty visionaries. And as a result, I continually see and quite often am able to talk to teenagers, young singles, young families with children who are being drawn to Jesus Christ and the Christian life in that congregation. Oh, like some live congregations, it has a bit of a revolving door. There are always some people going out the back door while other folk are coming in the front. But I don't think that's an ultimate judgment. Not every place is for everyone. But I can just say what a privilege it is to live in a community where there's a congregation like that day in, day out, with lots of human frailty, is ministering Jesus Christ to an astonishingly broad spectrum of a Toronto community. Thank God for the Baptists. Thank God for the Convention Baptists. Thank God that there are many of their congregations who are open in wonderful ways to what God is doing. And I was delighted in my last conversation with McClaverty to have him tell me the congregation has granted him an 8-month sabbatical. Now, there you are. You give the theological prof sabbaticals. I think pastors deserve them too. I think a lot of the U.S. churches have been doing this. I've met them in various places. I haven't found too many Canadian churches. Here is one. I think it shows how alert it is. A pastor after 15 years in a congregation like that, doesn't matter, he's now 44, he still must be pretty well exhausted. And he needs to recharge his batteries. And he was telling me, and how happy I was about this, he's going to do a DMin, not at Acadia, but at Western Seminary in Holland, Michigan, the seminary of the Reformed Church of America, not because he's becoming a Calvinist, or at least a Reformed Church or Presbyterian or whatever you want to call it, but because there is a professor of evangelism there with whom he wants to work, and they've been talking and discussing, and McClaverty is going to do a project on evangelism in the postmodern world, seeking to understand the thought forms and the responses of modern society. And I was just so overjoyed to hear of the pastor of a local congregation who was going to be doing that kind of thing. So thank God for the consistency of interest in renewal on the part of so many Baptists. And if there is any truth in the theory that Baptists may be slow to start, but when they start they really get going, maybe we can see what might be done to help the startup be just a little more speedy. Thank you.